Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her neighborhood gym. Every morning at 6 sharp, she would slip through the glass doors wearing the same oversized gray hoodie and loose-fitting sweatpants. Her routine never varied. 30 minutes on the treadmill followed by light weights, then stretching in the corner where fewer people gathered. She kept her head down, avoided eye contact, and left as quietly as she had arrived. The regulars at Iron Core Fitness had noticed her consistent presence over the past 8 months, but nobody really knew her story. To them, she was just another face in the crowd, someone trying to stay in shape without much intensity or purpose. Her workouts seemed almost apologetic, as if she was going through the motions rather than pushing herself toward any real goal. Marcus Thompson was different. At 28, he was the unofficial leader of the morning crowd, a former college football player whose booming voice and confident swagger commanded attention wherever he went. He had built a small following of admirers who hung on his every word about fitness, nutrition, and what he considered the right way to train. Marcus believed in pushing limits, in sweat and pain, in the kind of intense workouts that left people gasping for air and questioning their life choices. The morning everything changed started like any other. Sarah arrived at her usual time, signed in with a polite nod to the desk clerk, and began her familiar routine. She had just started her warm-up on the treadmill when Marcus and his group of 3 friends claimed the bench press station nearby. Their conversation, as usual, was loud enough for half the gym to hear. "I'm telling you guys, consistency is everything," Marcus declared, adjusting the weight plates with unnecessary force. "You can't just show up and go through the motions. You've got to want it, you know? You've got to be willing to sacrifice." His friend Jake, a stocky guy in his early 30s, nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, man. Like, what's the point of even coming here if you're not going to push yourself? Some people just don't get it." Sarah tried to tune them out, focusing on the steady rhythm of her feet hitting the treadmill belt. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle situations like this was to become invisible, to blend into the background until the moment passed. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the way Marcus kept glancing in her direction, or the way his voice seemed to carry just a little too far across the gym floor. "See that girl over there?" Marcus said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Been coming here for months, same routine every day. Walking pace on the treadmill barely breaks a sweat. I bet she's got some excuse ready if anyone asks why she's not trying harder." Sarah's hands tightened on the treadmill handles, but she kept her pace steady. She had dealt with people like Marcus before, people who made assumptions about others without knowing their stories. In her experience, the best response was no response at all. But Marcus wasn't finished. "I guarantee you she's got some sob story about why she can't really exercise. Bad knee, busy schedule, genetics. There's always something. People love their excuses more than they love results." Jake laughed, the sound harsh in the morning quiet. "Oh man, remember that guy last year who claimed he couldn't do cardio because of his breathing condition? Turned out he just didn't want to work hard." "That's what I'm talking about," Marcus continued, loading more weight onto the bar. "Real training isn't comfortable. It's not supposed to be easy. If you're not willing to push through discomfort, you might as well stay home and watch TV." The words hit Sarah harder than she had expected. For months, she had been rebuilding herself, piece by piece, finding the courage to even step foot in a gym again. Every workout was a victory. Every completed set a small triumph over the voice in her head that told her she wasn't strong enough, that she would never be whole again. She increased the speed on the treadmill slightly, not because she wanted to prove anything to Marcus, but because she felt a familiar fire building in her chest. It was the same feeling that had gotten her through months of physical therapy, through sleepless nights when the pain was too much to bear, through moments when she had wondered if she would ever feel normal again. "The thing is," Marcus was saying, his voice growing more animated, "some people just weren't built for this lifestyle. They come in here thinking they can just coast, do the minimum, maybe lose a few pounds for summer. But real fitness, real strength, that requires dedication they don't have." Sarah's breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. She could feel her heart rate climbing, not from the gentle pace on the treadmill, but from the memories that Marcus's words were stirring up. Images flashed through her mind, a convoy of military vehicles, the smell of desert sand, the sudden sound of an explosion that changed everything. I bet if we asked her right now what her training goals are, she'd give us some weak excuse about just trying to stay healthy, Marcus continued. No real ambition, no drive to excel. That's the problem with this generation. Everyone wants participation trophies. Sarah's finger hovered over the stop button on the treadmill. She could end this right now, finish her workout in silence, and go home to the small apartment where she felt safe. It would be so easy to slip away unnoticed, to let Marcus and his friends continue their conversation without ever knowing who they were really talking about. But something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was the 8 months of steady progress she had made, or the way her body had slowly begun to feel like her own again. Maybe it was the memory of who she used to be before everything changed. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of being invisible, tired of letting other people's assumptions define her experience. She stepped off the treadmill and walked over to where Marcus was preparing for his next set. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, the way she had been taught to move in situations where every step mattered. The gym seemed to grow quieter as other members noticed the interaction about to unfold. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about training excuses." Marcus looked up from the bench, surprised by the interruption. He had expected her to continue ignoring him, the way she always did. Up close, he could see that her face was younger than he had thought, probably mid-20s, with dark eyes that seemed to hold more weight than someone her age should carry. "Oh, hey," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "I wasn't talking about you specifically or anything, just making a general observation about, commitment levels." Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand. You were saying that people like me probably have excuses for why we can't train harder, right? That we're not willing to push through discomfort?" Jake and the other two guys had stopped their own workout to listen. The attention made Sarah's skin prickle, but she held her ground. She had faced much worse than a few curious stares. "Look, I didn't mean anything personal by it," Marcus said, though his defensive tone suggested otherwise. "I just think people could benefit from challenging themselves more, getting out of their comfort zones." "Comfort zones," Sarah repeated, as if testing the words. "That's an interesting concept." She could see the confusion in Marcus's eyes, the way he was trying to figure out if she was angry or just making conversation. The truth was, Sarah wasn't entirely sure herself. All she knew was that something had been building inside her for months, and Marcus's casual dismissal had finally brought it to the surface. "The thing is," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "you're absolutely right about one thing. Real training does require pushing through discomfort. It requires facing things that scare you, doing things that hurt, and finding ways to keep going even when every instinct tells you to stop." Marcus nodded, apparently thinking she was agreeing with him. "Exactly. That's all I was saying. But here's where you're wrong," Sarah said, taking a step closer. "You assume that just because someone's workout doesn't look intense to you, they're not pushing themselves. You assume that just because someone isn't grunting and sweating and making a show of their effort, they're not fighting their own battles." The gym had grown noticeably quieter. Other members were pretending to focus on their workouts while obviously listening to the exchange. Sarah could feel their attention like a weight on her shoulders, but she didn't let it stop her. "I've been coming here for 8 months, she said. "Same time every day, same basic routine. And you know what? Every single workout has been the hardest thing I've done that day. Not because the weights are heavy or because I'm running fast, but because just being here, just moving my body, just trusting it to carry me, that's my comfort zone challenge." Marcus was starting to look uncomfortable. This wasn't going the way he had expected when he first started his commentary. "I mean, that's great that you're consistent," he said. "I wasn't trying to criticize your efforts or anything." "Yes, you were," Sarah said simply. "You were criticizing me specifically, and people like me in general. You made assumptions about my motivation, my commitment, and my excuses. And normally, I would just let it slide. Because I've learned to pick my battles carefully." She paused, reaching up to grip the zipper of her hoodie. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the significance of what she was about to do. For 8 months, she had kept her truth hidden under layers of loose clothing and careful positioning. Only her doctors and therapists had seen what lay beneath. "But today, I'm tired of letting people assume they know my story," she continued. "I'm tired of being judged by people who have no idea what real discomfort looks like." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. You want to know why I don't train harder? Why I stick to my easy routine? Why I don't push myself the way you think I should? She gripped the zipper more firmly. Let me show you what real training looks like. The silence in the gym was almost complete now. Even the music seemed to fade into the background as Sarah began to slowly pull down the zipper of her hoodie. Marcus and his friends watched in growing confusion, unsure of what was happening but sensing that something significant was about to unfold. As the zipper reached the bottom, Sarah shrugged off the hoodie and let it fall to the floor. Underneath, she wore a simple black sports bra that revealed what she had been hiding for 8 long months. The scars were impossible to ignore. They began at her left shoulder and traced a jagged path across her chest and down her right side, angry red lines that spoke of trauma and surgery and healing that was still ongoing. The largest scar ran from just below her collarbone to her rib cage, a reminder of the surgery that had saved her life. Smaller scars dotted her arms and shoulders, evidence of shrapnel that had been painstakingly removed piece by piece. Marcus's face went white. The cocky confidence that had defined his morning had evaporated completely, replaced by something that might have been shame or horror or both. His friends stood frozen, suddenly understanding that they had wandered into territory they were completely unprepared for. This is what I'm training around, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the moment. Every time I raise my arm above my head, I'm working against scar tissue that wants to pull tight. Every time I take a deep breath on that treadmill, I'm pushing against lungs that are still learning how to expand fully again. Every step I take is a reminder that I'm lucky to be walking at all. The gym remained silent. The only sound, the hum of air conditioning and the distant clank of someone's workout in the far corner. Sarah stood there in her vulnerability, no longer hidden behind oversized clothing, no longer invisible. I was a combat medic, she continued, though she hadn't planned to share that detail. Second tour in Afghanistan. Our convoy hit an IED on what was supposed to be a routine supply run. 3 of my friends died that day. I spent 6 months in military hospitals, learning how to use my body again. Marcus looked like he might be sick. I had no idea. I'm sorry, I never would have. Of course you wouldn't have, Sarah said, not unkindly. Because you never asked. You never wondered if there might be more to someone's story than what you could see from across the gym. You just assumed. She bent down and picked up her hoodie, but she didn't put it back on. For the first time in months, she let her scars be visible. Let her truth be known. So, yes, I have an excuse for why I don't train the way you think I should, she said. But it's not the kind of excuse you were imagining. It's the kind that comes with nightmares and survivor's guilt and physical limitations that most people can't even comprehend. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of revelation and misunderstanding. Sarah could see the shame in Marcus's eyes, the way he was struggling to find words that could somehow undo what had been said. But she also saw something else, a glimmer of respect, maybe even admiration, for the courage it had taken to stand there and share her truth. Every day I come here, she said, her voice growing softer now, is a victory. Every rep, every step, every moment, I trust my body to carry me. That's my training. That's my pushing through discomfort. That's my refusing to quit. She looked around the gym, taking in the faces of the other members who had witnessed this moment. Some looked away, embarrassed by their own assumptions. Others met her gaze with something that might have been understanding. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, Sarah said, turning back to Marcus. I'm telling you this because assumptions are dangerous. They're lazy, and they hurt people in ways you might never realize. With that, she pulled her hoodie back on, zipped it up to her chin, and walked back to the treadmill. Her routine wasn't finished, and she wasn't about to let this confrontation derail the progress she had worked so hard to achieve. Behind her, Marcus and his friends stood in stunned silence, the weight of their words and assumptions settling over them like a heavy blanket. The gym slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in the morning dynamic. Sarah stepped back onto the treadmill and resumed her pace, steady and controlled as always. But this time, she held her head a little higher, her shoulders a little straighter. She had done something she never thought she would do. She had let herself be seen, truly seen, by strangers who had no right to judge her journey. As the minutes ticked by, she could feel eyes on her from across the gym, but the quality of attention had changed. It was no longer dismissive or mocking. It was respectful, maybe even awed by the strength it took to show up every day despite everything she had been through. The morning workout continued, but everyone in Iron Core Fitness knew that something important had happened. They had witnessed a moment of raw honesty, a stripping away of assumptions and pretense that revealed the true meaning of strength and perseverance. Sarah finished her 30 minutes and moved on to the weights section, her routine unchanged but somehow different. She had crossed a line today, stepped out of the shadows she had been hiding in for months. There would be no going back to complete invisibility, no returning to the safety of being completely unknown. But as she began her first set of carefully controlled movements, working around the limitations that her body still carried, she realized that maybe that was exactly what she had been training for all along. Maybe this moment of courage, this refusal to be diminished by someone else's narrow vision, had been the real goal all along. The weights felt different in her hands now. Not heavier, but more significant. Each rep carried the weight of her truth, her survival, her refusal to be anything less than exactly who she was. And for the first time since she had started coming to Iron Core Fitness, Sarah Martinez smiled while she worked out. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Iron Core Fitness at her usual time, but everything felt different. Word of what had happened the previous day had spread through the gym's tight-knit community like wildfire. As she signed in at the front desk, she noticed the way conversations seemed to pause when she walked by, how people's glances lingered just a moment longer than usual. Marcus was already there, earlier than his typical arrival time. He stood near the free weights section, clearly waiting for her, his usual confident posture replaced by something more uncertain. When their eyes met across the gym floor, he raised his hand in a tentative wave that she acknowledged with a slight nod, before heading to her usual treadmill. The weight of revelation sat heavy on Sarah's shoulders as she began her warm-up. Yesterday had been cathartic in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also opened a door she couldn't close again. The protective anonymity she had cultivated so carefully over the past 8 months was gone, replaced by a visibility that felt both liberating and terrifying. About 10 minutes into her routine, Marcus approached, walking slowly as if he were approaching a wounded animal. His usual swagger was completely absent, replaced by a humility that transformed his entire presence. "Sarah?" he said quietly, having to raise his voice slightly over the sound of the treadmill. "Could I talk to you for a minute? When you're ready, I mean. No rush." She looked at him carefully, noting the way his hands fidgeted at his sides, the uncertainty in his eyes. This was not the same man who had so casually dismissed her efforts just 24 hours earlier. "I'm almost done with this set," she said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Give me 5 minutes." Marcus nodded and stepped back, clearly relieved that she hadn't simply ignored him. He waited nearby, not in his usual position of dominance over the gym space, but off to the side like someone seeking permission to belong. When Sarah finished her cardio and toweled off, she joined him in a quieter corner of the gym where they could speak without drawing too much attention. Up close, she could see that he looked tired, as if he hadn't slept well. "I owe you an apology," he began, the words coming out in a rush. "Not just for yesterday, but for months of being an ass. I've been thinking about what you said all night, and you're absolutely right. I made assumptions about you, about your commitment, about your reasons for being here. I was completely out of line." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or the kind of performative apology people sometimes offered when they were caught behaving badly. But what she saw instead was genuine remorse and something that looked like real self-reflection. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "But I need you to understand that this isn't just about hurt feelings. The things you said, the assumptions you made, they're part of a bigger problem. People like me deal with that kind of judgment constantly, and it makes spaces like this feel unwelcome and unsafe." Marcus nodded vigorously. "I get that now. I'm starting to get it. I've been thinking about all the times I've made comments about people without knowing their stories. How many others have I hurt without even realizing it?" The vulnerability in his admission surprised Sarah. She had expected a quick apology, maybe an awkward attempt to move past the incident. Instead, Marcus seemed to be grappling with something much deeper. "Can I ask you something?" he said, then quickly added, "You don't have to answer if it's too personal." Sarah waited. How do you do it? How do you come in here every day knowing that people might be watching, might be judging? I can't imagine having that kind of courage. The question caught her off guard. In all the months since her return from Afghanistan, no one had ever asked her about courage. They had talked about recovery, about healing, about moving forward, but never about the daily choice to be brave. I don't think of it as courage, she said slowly. I think of it as necessity. After everything that happened over there, after losing my friends, after months of not knowing if I'd ever be able to live normally again, giving up isn't an option. Coming here, doing what I can with what I have left, that's just survival. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I served too, he said finally. Army Reserve, 2 deployments to Iraq. But I was lucky. Came home without a scratch, at least physically. I think maybe that's why I push so hard here, why I'm always talking about not having excuses. I feel guilty about how easy I had it compared to others. This revelation shifted something in Sarah's understanding of him. She had assumed his intensity came from arrogance or a need to dominate, not from his own complicated relationship with military service. Survivor's guilt is real, she said, but taking it out on people who are dealing with their own struggles isn't the answer. I know that now, Marcus said. I'm hoping you might let me try to make things right. Not just with you, but with this whole environment. I realize I've been part of creating a culture here that's not welcoming to everyone. Sarah considered this carefully. She had learned to be wary of grand gestures and promises of change, especially from people who had shown their true colors so clearly. But there was something in Marcus's demeanor that suggested his remorse was genuine. What did you have in mind? She asked. I was thinking about starting a different kind of training group, Marcus said, his words gaining momentum as he spoke. Something focused on adaptive fitness, on working with limitations rather than pretending they don't exist. I've been doing some research online, and there are a lot of people who could benefit from that kind of approach. The idea was intriguing, but Sarah remained cautious. And you think you're qualified to lead something like that? Marcus shook his head immediately. Not alone, no. I was hoping you might consider co-leading it with me. You have experience I could never have, understanding of what it means to rebuild from serious trauma. I have some knowledge about fitness and training techniques. Together, maybe we could create something valuable. Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus began to look nervous, probably wondering if he had overstepped again. The truth was, she was surprised by how much the idea appealed to her. For months, she had felt isolated in her recovery, as if she were the only person trying to navigate fitness with significant physical limitations. The possibility of creating a space where others like her could feel welcomed and understood was compelling. I'd need to think about it, she said finally. And if I agreed, there would have to be ground rules. This couldn't be about you trying to assuage your guilt or looking good to other people. It would have to be genuine, focused on serving the people who need it. Absolutely, Marcus said quickly. This isn't about me at all. It's about recognizing that I've been part of a problem and wanting to be part of a solution instead. Their conversation was interrupted by Jake, Marcus's usual workout partner, who approached with obvious hesitation. Sarah tensed slightly, remembering his participation in yesterday's mocking commentary. Hey, Jake said, addressing both of them but looking primarily at Sarah. I wanted to apologize too, for what I said yesterday, for laughing at your situation without knowing what you've been through. It was wrong, and I'm sorry. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his apology, though she could see he was still processing the full impact of what had been revealed. The thing is, Jake continued, Marcus told me about this idea for a new kind of training group, and I wanted you to know that I think it's needed. My sister has fibromyalgia, and she stopped going to gyms years ago because people would make comments about her lazy workouts. Maybe if there were more spaces that understood chronic conditions and limitations, she'd feel comfortable trying again. This perspective added another layer to Sarah's understanding of how widespread the problem really was. Her situation was dramatic and visible once she chose to reveal it, but there were countless others dealing with invisible conditions, chronic pain and recovery challenges who faced similar judgment and exclusion. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself gradually warming to the idea of the adaptive fitness group. She agreed to meet with Marcus regularly to discuss the concept. and their conversations revealed a depth of thought and genuine commitment that impressed her. Marcus had clearly done extensive research, reaching out to physical therapists, occupational therapists, and other fitness professionals to understand best practices for working with people who had various limitations. More importantly, he had begun changing his own behavior in the gym. Sarah noticed how he interacted differently with other members, approaching conversations with curiosity rather than judgment, offering encouragement rather than criticism. His transformation wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was consistent and appeared sincere. The first meeting of their adaptive fitness group was scheduled for a Saturday morning when the gym was typically less crowded. Sarah had helped Marcus create flyers and social media posts that emphasized inclusion, respect, and working within individual capabilities rather than pushing toward arbitrary standards. She arrived that morning with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Part of her worried that no one would show up, that the idea would fail before it even began. Another part worried that too many people would come, overwhelming her ability to maintain the emotional boundaries she had worked so hard to establish. Marcus was already there, setting up chairs in a circle and arranging some basic equipment they might use for demonstrations. His nervous energy was obvious, and Sarah realized that this moment was probably as significant for him as it was for her. "How are you feeling about this?" she asked as she helped him arrange the space. "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I can't help people the way they need? What if this whole thing is just me trying to make myself feel better about being a jerk for so long?" Sarah appreciated his honesty. "Those are good questions to be asking yourself," she said. "The fact that you're worried about saying the wrong thing probably means you're less likely to actually do it. And as for helping people, we'll figure it out together. Nobody expects us to have all the answers on day one." The first person to arrive was Jake's sister, Maria, a woman in her 40s who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing chronic pain. She was followed by Tom, a veteran in his 50s who had lost his right leg below the knee in Vietnam, and then by Linda, a breast cancer survivor who was dealing with lymphedema that affected her arm mobility. As more people arrived, Sarah realized that each person carried their own story of physical challenge, whether from injury, illness, surgery, or chronic condition. There was David, a young man with cerebral palsy who wanted to build strength despite his mobility limitations. There was Jennifer, who was recovering from a stroke and trying to regain coordination and confidence. There was Robert, whose diabetes had led to some vision loss and neuropathy in his feet. By the time they officially started, 12 people had gathered in their circle. Marcus looked around the group with something approaching awe, as if he couldn't believe that his idea had brought together such a diverse collection of individuals. "I want to start by saying thank you," he began, his voice less confident than Sarah had ever heard it. "Thank you for trusting us enough to show up, for being willing to try something new, and for sharing your time with us." He paused, looking directly at Sarah before continuing. "I also want to acknowledge that I'm not the person who should be leading this conversation alone. A few weeks ago, I made some really hurtful assumptions about someone's fitness journey, and that person, Sarah, called me out on it in a way that changed how I think about everything we do in spaces like this." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety as attention turned to her, but she also felt something she hadn't expected: gratitude for Marcus's willingness to admit his mistakes publicly. "Sarah has agreed to co-facilitate this group with me," Marcus continued, "because she understands things about adaptive fitness that I'm still learning. She's going to share a little bit about what brought us to this point, and then we'll go around and hear from everyone about what you're hoping to get from this experience." Sarah stood up, her heart beating faster, but her resolve steady. "A few weeks ago, I did something I never thought I'd do," she began. "I showed a room full of strangers my scars, not because I wanted sympathy or attention, but because I was tired of being invisible, tired of having my efforts dismissed by people who didn't understand my situation." She looked around the circle, meeting each person's eyes. "I'm a veteran. I was injured in Afghanistan, and my recovery has been a long process of learning to trust my body again, learning to work with limitations that aren't going away. Coming to the gym every day has been part of that recovery, but it's also been isolating because I felt like I couldn't share the real challenges I was facing." Maria nodded vigorously. "That's exactly how I feel. People see me moving slowly or taking breaks and they assume I'm lazy or uncommitted. They don't understand that some days just showing up is a victory. Which is why we're here, Sarah continued. This group is about creating a space where showing up is celebrated, where working within your limitations is seen as strength, not weakness, where you can share the real challenges you're facing without judgment. Tom, the Vietnam veteran, spoke up. I've been dealing with people's assumptions about my prosthetic for decades. Even in the gym, I get looks when I modify exercises or use different equipment. It would be nice to work out somewhere that gets it. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced since beginning her recovery. Person after person shared their stories, their frustrations, their small victories and ongoing struggles. There was Linda, whose mastectomy had left her feeling disconnected from her body and uncertain about how to exercise safely. There was David, whose cerebral palsy meant that traditional fitness advice rarely applied to his situation. Marcus listened to each story with focused attention, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes. Sarah watched him carefully, looking for signs of the judgmental attitude he had displayed so prominently before. Instead, she saw genuine engagement and what appeared to be growing understanding of how complex and individual each person's fitness journey really was. When it was time for the physical portion of their session, they started with simple movements that could be adapted for various limitations. Sarah demonstrated modifications for upper body exercises that worked around her scar tissue, while Marcus showed alternatives for people with lower body limitations. Tom shared techniques he had developed for maintaining balance during strength exercises, and Maria described pacing strategies that helped her manage fatigue. The session wasn't about pushing anyone to their limits or achieving specific performance goals. Instead, it was about movement, adaptation, and the radical idea that every person's effort was valuable regardless of how it looked to outside observers. As the group wound down, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything she had experienced in her individual workouts. This wasn't just about her own recovery anymore. It was about creating something larger, something that could serve others who had felt as isolated and misunderstood as she had. "So what do you think?" Marcus asked quietly as they helped people gather their belongings. "Was this what you had in mind?" Sarah looked around at the small groups of people who had formed, exchanging contact information and making plans to meet for coffee. She saw Jennifer laughing with Linda about something and David discussing workout modifications with Tom. The energy in the room was warm and inclusive in a way that the general gym environment rarely achieved. "It's a start," she said, and she meant it. A really good start. As people began to leave, many of them stopped to thank both Sarah and Marcus for creating the opportunity. The gratitude in their voices was genuine, and Sarah realized that the vulnerability she had shown that day weeks ago had rippled outward in ways she never could have anticipated. When the gym had returned to its normal Saturday quiet, Marcus and Sarah sat down to debrief the session. The transformation in Marcus's understanding was obvious, but Sarah was curious about how the experience had affected him personally. "How do you feel about what just happened?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, apparently trying to find the right words. "Humbled," he said finally, "and grateful. Every person in that circle is dealing with challenges that make my worst day look easy, and yet they're all here, trying, pushing forward. It makes me realize how shallow my understanding of strength really was." That's the thing about assumptions. They're usually based on incomplete information. When you take the time to actually understand someone's situation, it changes everything. "I keep thinking about all the people I probably discouraged over the years," Marcus said. "All the comments I made, all the judgments I passed without knowing anything real about their lives. I can't undo that, but maybe this group can be a way to do better going forward." The success of that first meeting led to regular weekly sessions that grew slowly but steadily. Word spread through social media, through referrals from physical therapists and doctors, and through the simple but powerful mechanism of people who had felt welcomed and understood sharing their experience with others who might benefit. Sarah found herself looking forward to Saturday mornings in a way she hadn't anticipated. The group had become more than just an adapted fitness class. It was a community of people who understood that healing and strength came in many different forms. It was a place where her scars weren't something to hide, but rather evidence of her resilience and survival. Marcus, meanwhile, had discovered that his real gift wasn't in pushing people beyond their limits, but in helping them find ways to work effectively within those limits. His research into adaptive fitness techniques had become extensive, and he had begun taking courses in working with special populations. The change in his approach had affected his interactions throughout the gym, making him someone who offered support and encouragement, rather than criticism and judgment. The ripple effects extended beyond the Saturday group. Other gym members had begun approaching Sarah directly, sharing their own stories of injury, illness, or limitation. Some joined the adaptive fitness group, while others simply appreciated having someone who understood that their easy workout might actually represent tremendous effort and courage. Sarah realized that her decision to unzip her hoodie that morning had been about more than just standing up to one person's thoughtless comments. It had been about refusing to be diminished by other people's narrow definitions of strength and determination. It had been about claiming her right to exist in spaces that had felt unwelcoming, and in doing so, creating room for others to do the same. The morning routine at Iron Core Fitness had fundamentally changed. Where once there had been an atmosphere of competition and judgment, there was now something more inclusive and supportive. People still worked hard, still pushed themselves, but the definition of what that looked like had expanded to encompass many different forms of effort and achievement. And every Saturday morning, in a circle of chairs surrounded by adaptive equipment and filled with people whose stories of resilience were written in their modified movements and careful pacing, Sarah Martinez knew that her choice to be visible had created something valuable and lasting, and something that honored not just her own journey, but the journeys of everyone who had ever felt that their best efforts weren't good enough for someone else's standards. 6 months after the first meeting of the Adaptive Fitness Group, Iron Core Fitness had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Saturday morning sessions had grown from 12 participants to over 30, with a waiting list that Sarah and Marcus struggled to manage. But the changes extended far beyond one weekly class. The gym had officially partnered with the local Veterans Affairs office to provide specialized fitness programs for injured service members. They had installed new equipment specifically designed for people with mobility limitations. Most importantly, they had trained their entire staff in disability awareness and inclusive fitness practices. Sarah stood in front of a mirror in the gym's new adaptive equipment area, watching herself complete a set of modified pull-ups using a suspension trainer system that worked around her shoulder limitations. 6 months ago, she never could have imagined doing this exercise in full view of other gym members, her scars visible in her tank top, her adaptations on display for anyone who cared to observe. Now her visibility had become part of her strength. She had learned that hiding her reality hadn't protected her from judgment. It had only prevented her from finding community with others who shared similar challenges. "Hey, Sarah, can I interrupt for a second?" She turned to see Amanda Chen, a new member who had joined the adaptive group 3 weeks earlier. Amanda was in her early 30s, dealing with multiple sclerosis that affected her balance and coordination. She approached with the careful movements Sarah recognized in people who were still learning to trust their bodies. "Of course," Sarah said, toweling off and giving Amanda her full attention. "How can I help?" "I wanted to let you know that I talked to my neurologist about the group yesterday," Amanda said, her voice carrying excitement that made Sarah smile. She was so impressed with what we're doing here that she wants to refer other patients. She said it's exactly what she's been looking for: fitness programs that understand chronic conditions. This kind of feedback had become common as word of the group spread through medical networks. Physical therapists, occupational therapists, and doctors had begun referring patients who needed fitness support that went beyond traditional rehabilitation. Sarah had even been invited to speak at a medical conference about adaptive fitness approaches. "That's wonderful," Sarah said. "Make sure to connect her with Marcus about the referral process. We're trying to make sure new members get properly oriented before jumping into group sessions." As Amanda continued her workout, Sarah reflected on how much her own relationship with fitness had evolved. What had started as a necessary but private part of her recovery had become a public advocacy for inclusive fitness practices. She had discovered that her experience as a combat medic had given her skills that translated well to helping others navigate their own physical challenges. Marcus approached, carrying a folder of paperwork that had become a common sight as the program expanded. "Good news and challenging news," he announced. The good news is that the city recreation department wants to partner with us to expand adaptive fitness programs to their facilities. The challenging news is that they want us to train their staff, which means we need to develop a formal curriculum. The growth of their program had been organic and somewhat chaotic, built around individual needs and weekly problem solving, rather than systematic instruction. "That's a big step," she said. "Are we ready for that kind of expansion?" Marcus set down his folder and looked around the gym, taking in the afternoon scene. There was Tom working with David on balance exercises, their friendship having grown beyond the Saturday group. Maria was on a recumbent bike, pacing herself carefully but moving with more confidence than she had shown 6 months earlier. Linda was doing strength training with modifications that had been developed specifically for her post-surgery needs. "I think we have to be ready," Marcus said. "There are too many people who need this kind of support for us to keep it small and contained. And honestly, you've taught me enough about adaptive approaches that I think we could create something really valuable." The conversation was interrupted by Jake, who had become a regular volunteer with the group, despite not having any obvious physical limitations himself. His sister Maria's transformation had motivated him to contribute his time and energy to the program. "Sorry to interrupt," Jake said, "but we've got a situation I thought you should know about." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. In the months since the program had begun, they had dealt with various challenges: insurance questions, equipment needs, scheduling conflicts. But Jake's tone suggested something different. "There's a guy over by the free weights making comments about the adaptive group," Jake continued, lowering his voice. "I heard him telling his buddy that it's getting ridiculous how much attention and resources are going to people who can't keep up with normal fitness standards." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced that morning months ago when Marcus had first made his dismissive comments about her training. But this time, the feeling was accompanied by something different. Not just hurt, but anger on behalf of all the people who had found community and healing in their program. "Where is he?" she asked, already moving toward the free weight area. Marcus caught her arm gently. "Sarah, you don't have to handle this. I can talk to him, or we can get gym management involved." She looked at Marcus, seeing in his expression both protective instinct and understanding of why this mattered to her personally. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I think I need to handle this myself." The man in question was easy to identify. He was in his 20s, heavily muscled, with the kind of aggressive energy that Sarah had learned to recognize as insecurity masquerading as confidence. He was talking loudly enough for his complaints to be heard by several other gym members, including some participants from the adaptive group. Sarah approached him directly, the same way she had approached Marcus months earlier. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying the authority she had learned as a medic in combat situations. "I understand you have some concerns about our adaptive fitness program." The man, his gym membership tag identified him as Brett, looked surprised by the direct confrontation. "Oh, hey, I wasn't talking to you," he said dismissively, "just having a conversation with my friend here." "A conversation that other people can hear," Sarah pointed out. "A conversation that's making assumptions about people you don't know, dealing with challenges you don't understand." Brett's friend looked uncomfortable and began to back away, clearly not wanting to be part of whatever was about to unfold. But Brett himself doubled down, perhaps feeling like he needed to maintain his position now that he had been called out publicly. "Look, I'm sure those people have their struggles," he said. "But this is supposed to be a serious gym. All this focus on modified exercises and special equipment is changing the whole atmosphere. Some of us come here to actually push ourselves." Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing the exact same mindset she had confronted in Marcus. "I see. And you feel like accommodating people with different needs somehow diminishes your own workout experience?" "It's not about accommodating," Brett said, his voice getting louder. "It's about standards. If people can't handle real exercise, maybe they should find somewhere else to work out." The gym had begun to grow quiet around them, other members sensing the tension and beginning to pay attention. Sarah was aware of the audience, but more importantly, she was aware that several members of the adaptive group were present and listening to this exchange. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, her tone remaining conversational. "What do you think real exercise looks like?" Brett gestured broadly at the equipment around them. "You know, heavy weights, challenging cardio, pushing your limits, not spending 20 minutes doing modified movements that barely qualify as exercise. X zone. Sarah considered her response carefully. She had learned from her experience with Marcus that direct confrontation could be effective, but she had also learned that education often worked better than embarrassment. "That's an interesting perspective," she said. "Let me tell you about one of our group members. Tom is a Vietnam veteran who lost his leg in combat. He comes here 3 times a week to work on balance and strength exercises that help him navigate daily life without falling. Yesterday, he managed to complete a full set of single-leg deadlifts, something that requires more core strength and stability than most people can imagine." Brett shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. "Then there's Maria," Sarah continued. "She has fibromyalgia, which means she deals with chronic pain and fatigue that would put most healthy people in bed. But she shows up every week and pushes herself through workouts that help her maintain her mobility and independence. Last month, she was able to play with her grandchildren at the park for the first time in 2 years. The gym remained quiet, Sarah's words carrying clearly through the space. "And there's Linda," she said, "who's rebuilding her strength after a double mastectomy and chemotherapy. Every rep she does is working against scar tissue, lymphedema, and the lingering effects of treatment that nearly killed the cancer that was trying to kill her. She's been coming here for 4 months, and last week she was able to reach high enough to get dishes out of her kitchen cabinets without assistance." Sarah paused, looking directly at Brett. "So I'm curious, what part of that doesn't qualify as real exercise? What part of those efforts doesn't meet your standards of pushing limits?" Brett looked increasingly uncomfortable, apparently realizing that his position was becoming harder to defend in front of the growing audience. "I didn't mean," he started, then stopped. "Look, I'm sure those people are doing their best." "Their best," Sarah repeated. "Yes, they are. And their best happens to require more courage, more determination, and more genuine strength than anything you or I do in here on our worst days." She took a step closer. Not aggressively, but with the kind of presence that commanded attention. "You know what I think real exercise is?" she said. "Real exercise is showing up when every instinct tells you to stay home. It's working with what you have instead of giving up because you don't have what you used to. It's adapting when your body changes, finding new ways to stay strong when the old ways don't work anymore." The silence in the gym was almost complete now. Sarah was aware that this conversation had become a teaching moment not just for Brett, but for everyone within earshot. "Real exercise," she continued, "is a breast cancer survivor doing chest stretches to regain mobility after surgery. It's a stroke survivor working on coordination exercises to relearn basic movements. It's a veteran with PTSD forcing themselves to stay present and focused during a workout instead of letting flashbacks take over." Brett's face had gone red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Sarah couldn't tell. "Real exercise is a woman with multiple sclerosis celebrating the fact that she can walk on a treadmill for 10 minutes without falling, or a man with cerebral palsy strengthening the muscles that help him communicate more clearly. It's people choosing to work with their limitations instead of being defeated by them." She paused, letting the words settle. "You want to know what's not real exercise?" she said, her voice growing stronger. "Standing around criticizing other people's efforts because they don't meet your arbitrary standards. Making assumptions about people's capabilities based on what their workouts look like to you. Using your temporary good health as an excuse to diminish other people's struggles." Brett opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah wasn't finished. "I used to hide my own limitations," she said, beginning to unzip her hoodie again as she had done months earlier with Marcus. "I used to worry about people like you judging my workouts, thinking I wasn't trying hard enough, or that I didn't belong in spaces like this." She pulled off the hoodie, revealing the scars that had become familiar to many gym members, but were clearly new and shocking to Brett. "I was a combat medic in Afghanistan," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the quiet gym. "These scars are from an IED explosion that killed 3 of my friends and should have killed me. Every workout I do is built around damage that will never fully heal, around limitations that will never go away." Brett stared at the scars, his face now pale rather than red. "For 8 months, I worked out in oversized clothes, afraid to let anyone see what I was dealing with," Sarah continued. I let people make assumptions about my commitment and my capabilities because I was too scared to show them the truth. But I learned something important. Hiding doesn't protect you from judgment. It just prevents you from finding community with people who understand. She looked around the gym, making eye contact with various members of the adaptive group who had gathered to listen. These people, she said, gesturing toward Tom, Maria, Linda, and others, have taught me more about real strength than any fitness influencer or motivational speaker ever could. They've shown me what it looks like to refuse to give up, even when giving up would be completely understandable. Brett seemed to shrink as Sarah spoke, apparently beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his misunderstanding. So here's what I want you to understand, Sarah said, pulling her hoodie back on. This program isn't changing the gym's atmosphere. It's revealing what the atmosphere should have been all along. A place where everyone's efforts are respected, where adaptation is seen as creativity rather than weakness, where the measure of someone's workout isn't how it looks to you, but how it serves their individual needs. She stepped back slightly, giving Brett space to respond if he chose to. The next time you see someone doing modified exercises or using adaptive equipment, she said, instead of judging them, maybe ask yourself what it took for them to show up that day. Maybe consider that their easy workout represents more courage and determination than your hardest day in the gym. Brett stood there for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond. Finally, he spoke, his voice much quieter than it had been at the beginning of their exchange. I didn't think about it that way, he said. I'm sorry. I didn't know. But Sarah nodded. Now you do. The question is what you do with that knowledge. As the conversation ended and the gym gradually returned to its normal rhythm, Sarah felt the familiar surge of energy that came from standing up for something important. But this time, it was tempered by a deeper understanding of her role in the community that had grown around the adaptive fitness program. Marcus approached as Brett and his friend left the gym, probably for the day. That was incredible, he said quietly. The way you handled that? The way you educated instead of just shutting him down? That's exactly what this community needs. At this time, Dylan Zug crawled up at the gym members returning to their workouts, many of whom nodded respectfully in her direction. I keep learning that visibility is a choice, she said, not just about showing my scars, but about standing up for what this community represents. Over the following weeks, the incident with Brett became part of the gym's culture in positive ways. Other members began approaching adaptive group participants with curiosity rather than judgment, asking thoughtful questions about their exercises and modifications. The gym management used the event as a training opportunity for staff, reinforcing their commitment to inclusive fitness practices. More importantly, several people who had been hesitant to join the adaptive program finally felt comfortable participating. They had seen Sarah's willingness to advocate for the community, and it gave them confidence that their own struggles would be understood and respected. The program's expansion into the city recreation system moved forward successfully, with Sarah and Marcus developing training materials that emphasized both practical adaptive techniques and the broader philosophy of inclusive fitness. They were invited to speak at conferences, to train other fitness professionals, and to consult on adaptive equipment purchases. But for Sarah, the most meaningful development was smaller and more personal. One morning, as she finished her workout and prepared to leave, she noticed a young man in his 20s hovering near the adaptive equipment area. He walked with a slight limp and kept looking around nervously, as if he wasn't sure he belonged there. Sarah approached him the way she wished someone had approached her during her early days at the gym. "Hi," she said simply. "I'm Sarah. I help run the adaptive fitness group here. Is there anything I can answer for you about the program?" The young man, Kevin, he introduced himself, explained that he had been injured in a motorcycle accident 6 months earlier. He had been an avid runner before the accident, but damage to his hip and leg had ended his ability to run long distances. He was struggling with depression and isolation, feeling like he had lost a fundamental part of his identity. "I keep hearing about this group," Kevin said, "but I'm not sure I'm disabled enough to qualify. I mean, I can walk and everything. It's just different now." Sarah smiled, recognizing the confusion she had once felt about her own place in adaptive fitness spaces. "The beautiful thing about this group," she said, "is that it's not about qualifying based on the severity of your limitations. It's about finding ways to stay active and healthy while working with whatever challenges you're facing. She gestured toward the main gym area where their conversation months earlier had started this entire journey. I spent 8 months thinking I had to choose between hiding my limitations or giving up fitness entirely. This group taught me that there's a third option: adapting, modifying, and finding community with people who understand that every person's relationship with their body is unique. Kevin listened intently as Sarah described some of the group's participants and their diverse challenges. She could see him beginning to relax, beginning to believe that there might be a place for him in this community. "Why don't you come to our session this Saturday?" she suggested. "No pressure to participate, just observe and see if it feels like something that might be helpful." As Kevin agreed, and they exchanged contact information, Sarah realized that this moment represented the full circle of her journey. She had gone from being someone who hid her limitations in fear of judgment to someone who could offer hope and community to others facing similar struggles. That Saturday, Kevin joined the group and found immediate connection with other members who understood the grief of losing physical capabilities and the challenge of rebuilding identity around new limitations. Within a few weeks, he had become a regular participant and volunteer, helping other newcomers feel welcomed and understood. The adaptive fitness program continued to grow and evolve, but its core mission remained the same: creating space where every person's efforts were valued, where adaptation was celebrated as creativity, and where community formed around shared commitment to health and healing rather than shared performance standards. Sarah often reflected on that morning when she had unzipped her hoodie in front of Marcus and his friends. What had started as a moment of frustrated defiance had grown into something much larger, a movement that was changing how fitness spaces approached inclusion and accessibility. But perhaps most importantly, it had changed how she saw herself. She was no longer a combat medic trying to hide the evidence of her service and sacrifice. She was no longer a patient trying to recover in isolation from the judgment of others. She was an advocate, an educator, and a living example of the truth she had learned to embody: that real strength isn't about meeting other people's standards, but about showing up consistently for your own healing and growth. Every morning when she arrived at Iron Core Fitness, she carried with her the knowledge that her choice to be visible had created ripple effects she could never have imagined. Her scars had become not just evidence of survival, but symbols of the courage it takes to be authentically yourself in spaces that don't always make room for authenticity. And in the adaptive equipment area of the gym, where people of all abilities work together toward their individual goals, Sarah Martinez continued to unzip her hoodie every day, choosing visibility over hiding, community over isolation, and the radical act of believing that everyone deserves to take up space in the world exactly as they are.